There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday night like any other, wrapped in the quiet hum of a refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic. They carry no fanfare, no celestial announcement. They simply slip into the room, silent as a shadow, and rearrange the architecture of your entire world. For me, that moment smelled of laundry detergent and the faint, clean scent of Liam's skin. It was the moment a question, unspoken for years, began to demand an answer, not with a shout, but with a whisper that threatened to bring the whole carefully constructed edifice of our friendship tumbling down. He shifted on the far end of the couch, the worn springs groaning a soft complaint, and the space between us, a space I had meticulously measured and policed for 4 years, suddenly felt both infinite and suffocatingly small. His voice, when it came, was a low murmur, aimed at the television but meant entirely for me. "Promise you won't tell." The words were a stone dropped into the still water of the evening. I didn't know what they meant, not really, but I felt their weight instantly. They were heavy with a significance that had nothing to do with the low-budget sci-fi movie flickering on the screen. I turned my head slowly, watching the blue light of an exploding spaceship cast his face in stark relief, carving out the strong line of his jaw and the worry that had taken up residence between his brows for the past 3 months. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the screen, but his attention was a tangible thing, a current flowing directly into the space I occupied. I felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, a subtle shift that precedes a storm. My own promise, a silent one I had made to myself years ago, was to never breach the walls of our friendship, to live contently in the sunlit courtyard of what we were, and never, ever try the handle on the door to what we could be. His words felt like a key, slipped quietly into my hand. "Tell what?" I managed, my own voice a stranger in my throat, rough with disuse. He didn't answer for a long moment. He just exhaled, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the exhaustion of weeks. Then, with a fluid motion that seemed both impossibly slow and shockingly fast, he moved. He uncurled his long frame from the corner of the sofa, slid across the worn corduroy cushions, and slipped under the edge of the woolen blanket that was pulled around my legs. He didn't stop until his side was pressed firmly against mine, from shoulder to knee. His head found the hollow of my shoulder, fitting there as if it were a space carved out just for him, and a shudder racked his body, a single, violent tremor that I felt deep in my own bones. The promise he'd asked for suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. He was asking me to keep a secret that was only just beginning to unfold, a secret we were creating together in the quiet dark of my living room. And as his breathing began to even out, syncing with the frantic, terrified beat of my own heart, I knew, with a certainty that was both a thrill and a dread, that nothing would ever be ordinary again. Our friendship had been built on a foundation of shared spaces and easy silences. We met during freshman orientation, 2 solitary figures adrift in a sea of forced enthusiasm and nervous introductions. I was trying to photograph the way the late afternoon light caught in the ancient oak trees on the main quad, seeking refuge behind the lens of my father's old Minolta. Liam was just sitting on a bench under one of those trees, staring at the controlled chaos with the expression of a man who had been dropped into a foreign country without a map. He was a swimmer, all broad shoulders and lean muscle, even then, with a kind of kinetic energy that seemed barely contained by his skin. He looked like he should have been at the center of the crowd, not at its periphery. I, on the other hand, was exactly where I belonged, on the outside, observing. I took a picture of him, a candid shot of his profile against the dappled light, a portrait of loneliness that I recognized instantly, because it was my own. He must have heard the click of the shutter, because he turned, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, met mine. I expected annoyance, a challenge. Instead, I saw a flicker of recognition. "You see it too, huh?" he'd said, his voice quiet. "See what?" I'd asked, lowering the camera, feeling my cheeks flush with the heat of being caught. "The absurdity," he'd said with a small, wry smile. "Everyone's trying so hard to connect that they're just bouncing off each other like atoms in a box. That was the beginning. We didn't bounce off each other. We settled. Our friendship wasn't forged in the fire of late-night parties or dramatic confessions. It was grown slowly, organically, in the quiet soil of mutual understanding. We found we occupied a similar emotional frequency. We could spend hours in my dorm room, him studying fluid dynamics and me editing photos, without needing to fill the silence. The silence wasn't empty. It was a comfortable, shared space, a room we had built together where we could both just be. He was the anchor to my sometimes drifting boat, the one who would show up with pizza after I'd spent 12 hours in the darkroom, forgetting to eat. I was his harbor, the place he came when the pressures of his scholarship and the relentless demands of his coach became too much. He'd stretch out on my floor, close his eyes, and just breathe for an hour while I worked, recalibrating his own internal compass in the quiet of my world. The feelings, on my part, were a slow creep. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the patient, inexorable process of a tide changing. For the first year, he was just Liam. My friend. My best friend. The person who understood the language of my silences. Then, one winter afternoon, we were walking back from the library, a sudden snowstorm descending in thick, fat flakes. He was laughing about something one of our professors had said, and he'd thrown his head back, his face turned up to the sky. A snowflake landed on his eyelash, and he blinked, and the sunlight, diffused in silver through the clouds, caught the green of his eyes, and something in my chest simply shifted. It was a tectonic movement, subtle and deep, but it changed the entire landscape of my heart. Suddenly, I was aware of everything. The way his hand would sometimes brush against mine when we walked. The sound of his laugh, a low rumble that I felt more than heard. The specific scent of his shampoo, something clean and vaguely like sandalwood, that lingered on the pillow he used when he crashed on my couch. I became a student of him, an archivist of small gestures and fleeting expressions. I guarded this new, terrifying knowledge like a state secret. My camera became both my shield and my confessional. I had hundreds of photos of him, most of which he'd never seen. Liam mid-laugh, Liam asleep on the sofa with a textbook open on his chest, Liam staring out a rain-streaked window, his reflection a ghostly twin. They were my way of holding on to the moments, of saying the things I could never say aloud. To him, I was Alex, his steady, quiet friend, the observer. And I was terrified that if he ever saw me, the real me, the one who cataloged the cadence of his breathing, he would retreat so fast I'd be left with nothing but the echo of his absence. He dated, of course, a series of bright, bubbly girls who seemed to orbit his quiet intensity like cheerful planets. I was always polite, always friendly. I learned to perfect a mask of gentle indifference. I listened to his stories about them, offered advice when he asked for it, and felt a piece of myself erode with every word. Each girlfriend was a new wall built between us, a reinforcement of the natural order of things. He lived in a world of straight lines and clear-cut categories, and I was his friend, a resident of the comfortable, permanent platonic zone. I accepted it. I had to. The alternative, losing him entirely, was unthinkable. Our friendship was a house I had built, and I would rather live in one of its quiet, shadowed rooms forever than risk burning the whole thing to the ground for the chance of a little more light. The catalyst arrived in the form of a woman named Sarah. She was different from the others. Sharper, more intelligent, with a dry wit that actually seemed to challenge Liam instead of just admiring him. They were serious. For 2 years, they were a unit, a fixture. Sarah and Liam. Liam and Sarah. I thought, with a grim and aching finality, that this was it. This was the end of the chapter. He would build a new house with her, and the one we had shared would become a place he visited less and less frequently. I prepared myself for the inevitable distance, steeling my heart against the slow fade I was sure was coming. I was a good friend. I went to their dinner parties, I smiled, I made small talk with Sarah's friends, and each time, it felt like I was performing a complex and painful piece of theater. Liam seemed happy, and I told myself that was all that mattered. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, a prayer for a heart that refused to listen. I focused on my photography, burying myself in the darkroom, in the patient magic of watching images emerge from nothing. It was a fitting metaphor for my love for him, a thing that lived only in the dark, a secret that would be overexposed and ruined by the light of day. Then, 3 months before that night on the couch, the structure of Liam's world collapsed. He showed up at my apartment door late on a Thursday night, looking hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that held him together. He was soaked from a sudden downpour, and his hair was plastered to his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice. He just stood there on my welcome mat, dripping onto the hardwood floor, his green eyes looking dark and lost. "She's gone," he said, and his voice was a raw, broken thing. "She packed her things. She said I'm like a locked room she can't get into." I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside, pulled him into the warmth of my apartment, and closed the door behind him. I wrapped him in a towel and made him a cup of tea he didn't drink. He sat on my sofa, the same sofa where our lives would later pivot, and he stared at the wall, shivering, not from the cold, but from the shock. He didn't cry, not then. He just seemed to shut down. He talked in fragments, about the arguments they'd been having, about a growing distance he hadn't known how to bridge. He spoke of his own emotional reticence, his inability to articulate the things churning inside him, echoing the very words Sarah had apparently used. He felt like a failure, a fraud in the language of intimacy. I listened, my heart a painful, complicated knot of sympathy and a terrible, selfish flicker of something that might have been hope. I hated myself for it instantly. He was in pain, my best friend was shattered, and some dark, buried part of me saw not just his wreckage, but a clearing in the woods. That was the shift. The breakup with Sarah didn't just break him. It broke the seal on his carefully managed self-containment. The unknowing initiator, stripped of his primary emotional anchor, began to drift. And he drifted towards me. At first, it was small things. He started spending most of his nights at my place, claiming his own apartment felt too big, too empty. He'd bring takeout, and we'd fall back into our old, easy rhythm of quiet companionship. But there was a new fragility to him now, a neediness that had never been there before. He needed the background noise of my existence to keep the silence in his own head at bay. He was running from the ghost of a shared life, and my apartment, a space Sarah had rarely entered and had openly called Spartan, became his sanctuary. I didn't mind. Having him there felt like a return to an earlier, simpler time, before the complication of serious girlfriends. It was a dangerous nostalgia. The first time the line blurred, it was almost accidental. We were watching a movie, a tense thriller, and during a particularly jarring scene, he flinched and his hand landed on my knee. It was an absent, reflexive gesture, but he didn't move it. He just left it there, his fingers resting lightly on the denim of my jeans. My entire body went rigid. I was hyper-aware of the 5 points of contact, the slight pressure, the warmth seeping through the fabric. My mind became a screaming chaos of analysis. What did it mean? Was it intentional? Was it just a friendly, thoughtless touch? I sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then he shifted, pulling his hand back to run it through his hair, and the moment was gone. But it had left a crack in the wall, a hairline fracture in the foundation of our established dynamic. From then on, the architecture of our interactions began to change. The comfortable distance we'd always maintained started to shrink, millimeter by millimeter. He would sit closer to me on the sofa, his leg pressing against mine. He'd fall asleep, and his head would end up on my shoulder. The first time it happened, I sat perfectly still for over an hour, my arm going numb, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I studied the relaxed line of his mouth, the flutter of his eyelashes against his cheek, the absolute trust in his posture. He felt safe with me. The thought was both a comfort and a torment. He was seeking refuge in my proximity, drawing on my quiet strength to weather his own storm. But for him, it was comfort. For me, it was a slow, exquisite torture. Every casual touch was a brand. Every shared silence was filled with the deafening roar of the things I couldn't say. I was walking a tightrope over a canyon of my own making, and Liam, in his grief-stricken innocence, kept gently shaking the rope. The ritual began about a month after the breakup. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and we were both exhausted. We'd been talking for hours, Liam finally unpacking the finer, more painful details of his relationship with Sarah. He'd cried, finally. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but silent, steady tears that tracked down his face, each one feeling like a blow to my own chest. When he was done, a hollowed-out calm had settled over him. He stood up to go to the spare room, which had effectively become his room, but he paused in the doorway. "Hey, Alex," he'd said, his voice thick. "Yeah. It's really cold tonight, isn't it?" It wasn't. I had the thermostat set to a comfortable 70 degrees. But I understood. It was an excuse, a piece of plausible deniability he was offering both of us. It was a request wrapped in a question about the weather. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a door, and he was asking me to open it. I knew I should say no. I knew I should point him to the extra blankets in the linen closet and gently close the door, preserving the boundary that had kept us safe, kept me safe, for so long. But I looked at his face, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness that had been his constant companion for weeks, and I couldn't do it. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It is." He gave me a small, grateful nod. He disappeared into the spare room and came back a minute later, carrying his pillow. He didn't say another word. He just walked to the far side of my queen-sized bed, pulled back the covers, and slid in. He kept to his side, his back to me, a rigid line of tension in the dark. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of his breathing, acutely aware of him in my space, in my bed. It was an agony of proximity. The air was thick with unspoken things, with years of my own secret yearning and months of his raw, untethered grief. Eventually, his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to relax, to feel the profound, terrifying significance of what had just happened. He had crossed a line, but he had done it in a way that allowed us both to pretend he hadn't. It was cold. That was the reason. A simple, logical, entirely fabricated reason that protected us both from the truth. That night established the new pattern. The ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would end up in my bed. There was always a pretext at first. A nightmare he couldn't shake. A noise in the apartment building that spooked him. The ever-reliable excuse of the temperature. Each excuse was a thin veil, and with each repetition, the veil grew more transparent. We never spoke of it in the morning. We'd wake up, carefully disentangle ourselves if we'd moved closer in the night, and he'd go make coffee as if nothing unusual had occurred. It was a silent agreement, a conspiracy of denial. But in the dark, things were different. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. One night, I woke up to find his arm thrown across my chest, his face buried in my shoulder. My first instinct was panic, a jolt of pure terror that he would wake up and be horrified. But he was deeply asleep, murmuring something incoherent, and the sheer weight of him was anchoring, real. I didn't move. I lay there, matching my breaths to his, and allowed myself, for the first time, to simply feel it. To feel the reality of him beside me, holding on to me, without the frantic buzz of anxiety. It was a dangerous piece. The cuddling began to migrate from the bedroom to the living room. It became our default state. We'd be watching a movie on the couch, and he would just naturally shift, leaning his weight against me, eventually resting his head on my lap or curling up with his back pressed against my chest. I became his human security blanket. He was seeking something he couldn't name. Comfort, stability, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, and he had found it in me. And I, like a man dying of thirst, drank every drop of it, knowing full well it was probably poison. My life became a study in duality. By day, we were Alex and Liam, best friends. We went grocery shopping, we talked about work, we debated which movie to watch. Everything was normal, platonic, safe. By night, we were 2 bodies in the dark, seeking solace in a proximity that defied every label we had for our relationship. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. I was a seismologist, monitoring the subtle tremors in our dynamic, trying to predict the earthquake I was sure was coming. I analyzed every touch, every glance, every word. Did he mean to let his fingers linger when he passed me a mug? Was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention different than it used to be? I was losing my mind, caught in a feedback loop of hope and fear. Hope that this meant what I desperately wanted it to mean. Fear that I was just a convenience, a temporary port in his emotional storm, and that once the weather cleared, he would sail away, leaving me wrecked on the shore. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus. The quiet observer in me had been compromised. I was no longer on the outside looking in. I was in the heart of the storm, and I had no idea which way to turn. This brings me back to that night, the night of the promise. For 3 months, we had been living in this suspended state of ambiguity. The ritual was so established that the pretexts had fallen away. He didn't need to mention the cold anymore. He just came to my bed, or I would find him already there, having fallen asleep waiting for me. But the cuddling, the physical closeness, had always been a passive thing, something that happened while one or both of us were supposedly asleep or distracted by a screen. It was deniable, but this was different. This was the first time he had moved towards me with such clear, conscious intent while we were both awake and aware. He slid under my blanket not as a prelude to sleep, but as an act in and of itself. His request, "Promise you won't tell," hung in the air between us. Tell who? His friends? My friends? Ourselves? It was a plea for the sanctity of this fragile, liminal space we had created. He was asking me to protect it, to not give it a name, because a name would force it into the light, where it might not survive. He settled against me, his body a solid, warm line. I could feel the rhythmic beat of his heart through his t-shirt, a steady thrum against my ribs. He smelled of fabric softener and that faint, unique Liam scent that I had long ago committed to memory. His hair tickled my chin. I rested my cheek on the top of his head, a gesture that felt both monumental and perfectly natural. We stayed like that for the rest of the movie, and then long after the credits had rolled and the screen had gone black, casting the room into a deep, comfortable darkness. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The silence was no longer just comfortable. It was charged, laden with the weight of everything that was happening. He wasn't just seeking comfort from grief anymore. This felt different. This felt like a destination, not a refuge. A quiet, terrifying sense of inevitability began to settle in my bones. The tide had been coming in for months, slowly, patiently eroding the shoreline of our friendship. And I had a feeling that tonight, it was finally going to reach the seawall. After what could have been minutes or an hour, he stirred. He pushed himself up slightly, just enough to look at me. In the gloom, I could only make out the shape of his face, the glint of his eyes. The air grew thick, heavy. I could hear my own pulse roaring in my ears. This was it. The moment of truth. The tightrope was vibrating. "Alex," he whispered, and his voice was unsteady. My name on his lips was a question, an apology, a plea. I could only manage a hum in response, my throat too tight for words. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine in the dark. I saw a universe of conflict in that look. Fear, confusion, and a startling, undeniable flicker of want. He was as lost as I was. He was the one who had initiated all of this, who had pushed every boundary, but he had been doing it blind, following an instinct he didn't understand. Now, here in the dark, I think he was finally starting to see where he had been walking. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, and he was looking at me to see if I would fall with him. "Would it be okay?" he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. He took a breath and tried again, his whisper even softer than before, so soft it was almost just a breath of air shaped into words. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the sound of my own frantic heart. It all went silent. There was only his question, hanging in the space between our faces. It was the most terrifying and most beautiful question I had ever heard. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was making himself vulnerable, laying his confusion and his want at my feet, and giving me the power to validate it or destroy it. He was giving me the choice I had been too afraid to ever make for myself. For 4 years, I had lived in fear of this exact moment. convinced it would be the end of everything. But here, now, with his warm breath on my face and the weight of his body as solid comfort against mine, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. All the years of silent pining, of carefully guarded feelings, of aching loneliness, coalesced into a single, simple truth. The risk of losing him was terrifying, but the risk of not knowing, of living the rest of my life in the quiet courtyard of our friendship, always wondering what lay behind that one locked door, that was no longer a risk I was willing to take. I didn't answer with words. I closed the small distance between us and gently pressed my lips to his. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my countless daydreams. It wasn't passionate or desperate. It was tentative, searching, a question answered with another question. It was soft and unbelievably gentle. It was a discovery. His lips were hesitant at first, then they softened against mine, a quiet surrender. One of his hands came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek in a gesture of such profound tenderness that it nearly broke me. We were two cartographers, charting a new and unfamiliar coastline in the dark. The kiss was brief, lasting only a few seconds, but it redrew the entire map of my world. When we pulled away, we were both trembling. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "Okay," he whispered, a sound of pure relief. "Yeah, okay. I thought that was it. I thought that was the start of our new chapter." We had crossed the line, and the other side was quiet and safe and full of a fragile, burgeoning hope. I fell asleep that night curled against him, his arms securely around me, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in my head was completely, blissfully quiet. I had never felt more at peace. I was a fool. I had mistaken the eye of the storm for the end of it. The real wreckage was yet to come. The morning after was a study in jarring dissonance. I woke up first, to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the blinds. Liam was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, his arms still draped over my waist. For a few blissful moments, I just watched him, allowing the quiet joy of the new reality to sink in. He was here. This was real. The memory of the kiss was a warm, glowing ember in my chest. But when he started to stir, a sudden, cold spike of anxiety pierced through my contentment. What now? How do we act? What are we? He blinked his eyes open, and for a second, they were soft with sleep. He looked at me, and a small, slow smile touched his lips. The ember in my chest flared into a bonfire. But then, as full consciousness returned, the smile vanished. A shadow passed over his face. Confusion. Then something else. Panic. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned. He sat up, pushing himself to the far edge of the bed, creating a chasm between us. He wouldn't look at me. I should get going, he mumbled, his voice gravelly. Got an early meeting. A lot of work to do. He was out of the bed and pulling on his jeans from the day before in a matter of seconds. He moved with a frantic, clumsy energy that was the polar opposite of his usual fluid grace. He was a man fleeing the scene of a crime. My heart, which had been soaring only moments before, plummeted. "Liam," I said, my voice barely audible. "Coffee smells great," he said, not answering me, his back still turned as he grabbed his shirt. "But I can't. Really gotta run. I'll text you later." And then he was gone. He didn't just leave the room. He fled the apartment, the quiet click of the front door closing behind him sounding as final and deafening as a gunshot. I was left alone in the wreckage of the morning, the sheets beside me still warm from his body. The silence he left behind was not the comfortable, shared silence we had known. It was a void, a vast, echoing emptiness filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unasked questions. I had been so sure. The tenderness of his touch, the relief in his voice. Had I imagined it all? Had I superimposed my own desperate hopes onto his grief-stricken confusion? The thought was a cold, sickening dread that settled deep in my gut. Sarah's words came back to me, sharp and clear, a locked room she can't get into. Maybe I hadn't been given a key after all. Maybe I had just been a temporary guest who had overstayed his welcome, and in the clear light of day, he had finally remembered to throw me out. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. His promised text never came. I sent one, a casual, carefully worded message asking if everything was okay. He replied hours later with a curt, "Yeah, just swamped with work. Talk soon," but we didn't talk. He didn't come over. My calls went to voicemail. He was avoiding me, building a wall of silence and excuses brick by painful brick. The sanctuary my apartment had been for him had become a place he couldn't bear to be. And the ambiguity that had been a source of both anxiety and hope was now just a pure, unadulterated torment. I replayed the kiss, the conversation, the entire evening over and over in my mind, searching for the moment I had misread everything so completely. Had his question been a moment of weakness he now regretted? A drunken impulse, even though we hadn't been drinking? The not knowing was the worst part. It was a poison that seeped into everything. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I'd sit on the sofa, staring at the empty space beside me, the woolen blanket folded neatly over the armrest, a relic from a world that no longer existed. My quiet, ordered life had been thrown into complete chaos. The friendship that had been my anchor was gone, replaced by this gaping wound of silence. I felt a rising tide of anger mixing with the hurt. Anger at him for his cowardice, for initiating something so profound and then running away without a single word of explanation. And anger at myself for letting down my guard, for believing, for that one perfect night, that my secret love might not be a secret or unrequited after all. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't let it go on. The limbo was destroying me. If our friendship was over, I needed to hear it. If it was a mistake, I needed him to say it. I needed to know, even if the truth was the thing I feared most. I drove to his apartment. The one he had claimed felt too empty. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I felt like a man walking towards his own execution. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I knew the silence had to be broken, even if it meant shattering everything permanently. He opened the door after the third knock. He looked terrible. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt I'd seen him in 3 days ago on his social media. His apartment was a mess, takeout containers and scattered papers covering every surface. The swamped with work excuse was clearly a lie. He was hiding, drowning in his own confusion. When he saw me, his expression was a painful mix of guilt and fear. He didn't look angry or repulsed. He just looked lost. "Alex," he said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "You know what I'm doing here, Liam," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. The anger was giving me a strange sort of strength. "You can't just do that and then disappear. You don't get to do that." Not to me. He had the grace to look ashamed. He stepped back, letting me into the apartment, and closed the door. He leaned against it, refusing to meet my eyes, his arms crossed over his chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," he muttered to the floor. "Sorry for what?" I pressed, needing to hear the words. "Sorry you kissed me? Or sorry you ran away like a coward the next morning?" He flinched. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, pleading anguish. "I don't know, Alex. Okay, I don't know. I'm so confused. I don't know what's happening. Then talk to me," I exclaimed, my voice finally cracking, the frustration and hurt spilling over. "For God's sake, Liam, talk to me. For 4 years, we've been able to talk about anything. For the last 3 months, you have used me as your emotional life raft. You have slept in my bed. You have curled up against me on my couch. You have laid all of your pain and grief on me, and I have held it. I have held all of it for you. And then you kiss me. You asked to kiss me, and now you can't even look at me? You think that's fair?" Tears were welling in his eyes. He scrubbed at them furiously with the back of his hand. "No, it's not fair. Nothing about this is fair. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm scared." "Scared of what?" I asked, my voice softening slightly at the raw fear in his. "Scared of me?" "No," he said, his voice shaking. "Never of you. I'm scared of this. Of what it means. I've spent my whole life being one thing. You know? Captain of the swim team. Sarah's boyfriend. I had a path. It was all laid out. And now it's all gone. And that night, kissing you, it felt." He trailed off, struggling for the word. "It felt what, Liam?" I prompted, my heart hanging on his answer. He looked at me, his green eyes swimming with unshed tears, and his voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. It felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time. And that terrifies me. The confession hung in the air between us, as fragile and as powerful as the kiss itself. It was the truth, finally. Not a clean or easy truth, but the real, messy, complicated truth of his heart. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a feeling that didn't fit into the blueprint he had for his own life. The locked room Sarah had spoken of wasn't something he kept others out of. It was a room he had locked himself inside of, and the kiss had rattled the door off its hinges. All my anger dissipated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man whose map had just been revealed to be completely wrong, and he was standing alone in the wilderness, terrified of taking the first step onto a new path. I closed the distance between us, slowly, giving him time to back away. He didn't. I stood in front of him, and I gently took his hands, uncrossing them from his chest. His fingers were cold. I held them in mine. "Hey," I said softly. "Look at me." He raised his eyes to mine. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," I told him. "You don't have to know what it means or where it's going. All you have to do is stop running. Stop running from me. We can be scared together. We can be confused together. But we have to do it together. Okay? I can't do this silence again, Liam." It will break me. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Okay," he choked out. "Okay. I'm sorry, Alex. I'm so sorry, I know," I said. And I pulled him into a hug. He collapsed against me, his arms wrapping around me tightly. And this time, he cried. He sobbed into my shoulder, all the fear and confusion and grief of the past months, and the terror of the last week, finally coming out. I just held him, my own eyes burning, and I let him. I held him as he had held on to me in the dark, and I knew that this painful, messy, honest moment, was our real beginning. The kiss had been the question. This was the start of us figuring out the answer. The aftermath of the confrontation was not a sudden, magical fix. It was a slow and deliberate process of rebuilding. We didn't fall into a romantic relationship overnight. Instead, we entered a new phase of intentional honesty. The ambiguity that had defined us for months was gone, but it wasn't replaced by easy labels. It was replaced by conversation. We talked for hours that day in his messy apartment, and for many days after. He talked about the pressure he'd always felt to be a certain kind of man, the expectations he had internalized from his family, his teammates, from society. He admitted that his relationship with Sarah, towards the end, had felt more like a role he was playing than a life he was living. He confessed that the comfort he found with me was different, deeper. It wasn't just about solace from grief. It was a feeling of being seen, truly seen, in a way he never had been before. He was the locked room, and he realized my quiet presence had never been a threat to the door. I had just sat patiently outside, waiting, letting him know he wasn't alone in there. For my part, I finally told him everything. I told him about the snowflake on his eyelash, about the years of silent affection, about the hundreds of photographs I had of him stored on a hidden hard drive. I told him about the pain of watching him with his girlfriends, and the self-loathing I felt for the flicker of hope I'd had when he and Sarah broke up. I laid all my cards on the table, my own fear and vulnerability a mirror to his. He listened without judgment, his expression a mixture of surprise, remorse, and a kind of gentle wonder. "All this time," he'd asked, his voice full of awe, "you felt all that, and you were still just my friend? You never pushed. You never made me feel weird. You were just there. I didn't want to lose you," I said simply. I would have taken whatever version of you I was allowed to have. That admission seemed to land with a particular weight. It helped him understand the depth of the foundation we were standing on. This wasn't a whim. It wasn't a product of his confusion. It was something that had been growing, on my side at least, for a very long time. His feelings were new, nascent, and frightening, but they were rooted in something old and strong, our friendship. We started over in a way. We went on dates, real dates. We went out for dinner, to museums, for long walks in the park. It was strange and a little awkward at first, navigating this new dynamic in the light of day. We were learning a new language with which to speak to each other. We learned to hold hands in public, a simple act that felt both revolutionary and completely natural. The first time he reached for my hand as we walked down the street, his fingers lacing through mine without hesitation, I felt a jolt of pure, uncomplicated happiness. We were still Alex and Liam, but we were a version we were building together, brick by brick. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was no longer shrouded in plausible deniability or the cover of darkness. When he stayed over, which was most nights, it was with a shared, spoken understanding. The first time he kissed me again, it was in my kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the window. He just walked up to me while I was making coffee, wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, and kissed my neck. Then he turned me around and kissed me properly, a kiss that was full of certainty and a quiet, joyful confidence. There were no questions this time. There was no hesitation. It was just a statement. This is us now. The ritual of the couch evolved. We still spend our evenings there, but the space between us was gone for good. We were a comfortable tangle of limbs, my head on his chest or his on my lap. The woolen blanket became our shared flag, a symbol of the new territory we had claimed. The silence returned, but it too was transformed. It was no longer a space filled with unspoken tension and yearning. It was a peaceful harbor, a testament to the fact that we no longer needed words to understand each other. We had weathered the storm and found a quiet bay on the other side. One evening, a couple of months into this new life, we were lying on the sofa, watching some mindless documentary. Liam was asleep, his head on my chest, his breathing slow and even. I was looking through a new book of landscape photography, the pages filled with images of vast, open spaces. I thought about my own photography, about the portraits of him I had hidden away. I realized I hadn't taken a single picture of him since we had gotten together. The need had vanished. Before, the camera was my intermediary, a way to capture and hold a piece of him that I felt I could never have. It was a tool for a longing I couldn't express. But now, I didn't need to capture him. I had him. I had the real, solid, breathing man asleep on my chest. I could reach out and touch his hair, feel the steady beat of his heart against my own. The reality was infinitely better than any image I could ever create. He stirred, nuzzling his face into my shirt. "What are you thinking about?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Just how different everything is," I said softly, running my fingers through his hair. He tilted his head back to look at me, his green eyes soft and clear. "Good different. The best different," I confirmed. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He leaned up and gave me a soft, sleepy kiss. "Good," he said. "Because I'm not going anywhere." He settled back down, and within minutes, he was asleep again. And I knew he meant it. The restlessness that had defined him for so long was gone. The locked room was open, and he had found, to his own surprise, that he didn't want to be in there alone anymore. He had found a home in the quiet spaces of my life, just as I had always found one in his. We had rearranged the architecture of our world, and the new design was strange and beautiful and stronger than anything we had built before. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about the things we couldn't say, but about the things we no longer needed to. It was the quiet peace of finding a safe emotional harbor, a peace that felt, quite simply, like coming home.